Emily Leiker of Syracuse.com is our special guest. Let's talk Syracuse football. This is ACC Nation, podcast, streaming, radio, and YouTube. That's Will Ogenin. I'm Jim Quist. Welcome, Emily. We appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
A 3-0 start to the season. Would it be an understatement saying that the energy everyone believed Dino Babers would bring to the Syracuse football program initially has finally arrived?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm new on the beat. I just got here earlier this year, so I'm kind of having to get other people's perspectives on that take. But as far as I can tell, for a lot of people, this is the team they've been waiting for. I mean, obviously, Dino had a successful year back in 2018. The team went 10-3. That was a great season for them. But other than that, hasn't been super successful. So this 3-0 run here at the start of the season has fans really excited. And honestly, I don't usually like to look another 2 weeks ahead, but I really think they're heading into the NC State game, potentially a 5-0 team, which is just mind-boggling for a lot of people in the Syracuse area.
Interesting. Hey, even with this start, the opening consensus line, or we'll talk about this next game, the opening consensus line for the upcoming game with Virginia still has the Cavaliers as a 3.5-point favorite. Now, of course, that could change by the end of the week, like most stuff, betting lines for a game in the Dome. That's where I think the advantage is for Syracuse, and I'm thinking there's still carryover throughout the media from how 'Cuse was pictured in the conference in this game. Will they have to earn every bit of respect along the way?
Yeah, Dino Babers talked about that like a little bit today during his press conference, where he was like, we know what people were saying about us on the way in. We know who was on our train heading into the season and who's starting to hop on now that we're 3-0. So I think the team is very cognizant that people didn't have high expectations for them going into the season. I mean, obviously, like football coaches across the country, Babers was quick to say that they don't really care about that, and they've all had their own expectations for themselves and whatnot. But yeah, I think the interesting thing about like this 3-0 stretch is that yes, they've been good wins, but they haven't necessarily been wins that are so convincing you'd automatically rank them or anything like that. I mean, going into the season, I thought the Louisville game would be a big test to start the season, and didn't end up being the case. Louisville didn't look super great. Syracuse had a pretty commanding win there. UConn was an easy win for Syracuse. That was a 1-0 from even when I got here back in May and barely knew anything about the team. And then obviously still trying to process the Purdue game from this weekend, because that was a crazy one. So I think it is going to take a couple more weeks. I think if they get another ACC win over Virginia this week, that starts to change things. But they have a tough back half of the schedule. So I think that probably too is still keeping people a little skeptical of what that total outcome of this season will be.
So you being from Missouri, it's show me time,
Mm-hmm.
Got to show
The show me state.
I had to run with that. That was just laid right out there in front of me. It was too easy. Will, it's all yours. Let's get into what they're doing and who's doing it right. For Syracuse on offense and defense.
Yeah, I want to actually get into the chaoticness of that game against Purdue, because that was quite something. I mean, you're lucky. I think it was pretty much a low scoring, kind of a defensive game heading into the fourth quarter, and then all hell broke loose. And then, both teams 42 combined points. You've got Purdue kicking off from its own 10-yard line, Syracuse kicking off from the Purdue 35 because they basically imploded with penalties. So I'm sure as someone who writes feature, you probably had to rewrite your game story countless times during those final few minutes.
Yeah, which I was going to say, it's funny because I didn't even really process either of those weird two kickoffs that happened near the end of the game, because like as soon as the score happened, I was back in my document trying to edit the game story, and I was like, oh, it's just kickoff. Like, doesn't matter. Like, obviously I knew like, oh, there's flags being thrown, whatever. But then I got on Twitter like right as the game ended, and there was all these screenshots of the kickoffs, and I was like, oh boy, I I missed that. Like, didn't even like cross my mind trying to get everything into the game story. So yes, I rewrote multiple times. I had predicted that it was going to be a crazy game. I thought that it would be a close one. I thought that it would be the game that would get college football Twitter talking about Syracuse a little bit. I was very proud. I did predict that there would be missed kicks and turnovers, and there were indeed both in the game. There was just so much happening. And honestly, it wasn't even just like the scoring plays or even like the fourth quarter. Like the fourth quarter will be what that game is remembered for. But I wrote a story earlier today that was all of like the other moments, like the non-scoring plays and things like that. Like Purdue's first drive of the game, they're in the red zone. They're at the Syracuse 11-yard line, I think, 4th and 3, and they go for it instead of kicking a field goal. And everyone was just kind of like, why would you not put points on the board there? Turns out Jeff Brom thought it was a 4th and 1 and thought they were just automatically going to get it. So just things like that, like the whole game was crazy from start to finish. And I think it will be one to go down kind of in Syracuse lore, especially if this season ends up being a winning one.
So Sean Tucker kind of had an off day on Saturday. Only had 42 yards on 2.3 yards per carry. Was it just simply an off day, or was it something that you saw Purdue just really game plan to stop him?
The past couple weeks, because he really hasn't had a breakout performance yet this season. I mean, against Louisville and UConn, he put up over 100 yards, which is still great, still really good numbers. And he's still up there in the national and the ACC rankings. But yeah, this game, he really struggled. He didn't have a ton of yards. If you know his whole Twitter shtick of pleased and not pleased, this was the first not pleased we got of the season. Not pleased with his own performance. He was pleased with the outcome, obviously. I think it's a little bit of a mix. I think teams are coming into this season knowing that he is a big offensive weapon for Syracuse and game planning for him. So we're seeing a lot of double coverage on him, a lot of him getting stuffed pretty much as soon as he gets the ball in his hands. I think additionally, the changes in the offensive scheme with the new offensive coordinator, Robert Anae, they're using him in slightly different ways. Anae is a little bit more of a pass heavy coach, though I will say there is a lot of preaching of balance heading into this season, and there hasn't been as much balance as we thought there was going to be. So like on Saturday, we saw Tucker used as a decoy a lot. They would fake pitch the ball to him. The entire Purdue defense would follow, and then they'd get a pass off or something like that. So I think it's a couple different factors why he hasn't seen a bunch of success yet. And I'm curious to see kind of over these next 2 weeks if he's able to break out of that, because I think if he can break out and have a big game in the next 2 weeks, that bodes well for the rest of the season for him. If he continues to struggle, I don't know how much better it's going to get when they face defensive lines like the one that Clemson has.
Fair enough. So the hero of the game, Oronde Gadsden the second, and for those of you who remember NFL football from the early 2000s, yes, that's the same Oronde Gadsden who played for the Dolphins. This is his son, but he's been kind of made a real nice start to seeing that 6 catches in this game. Obviously someone who is still really, really young in his Syracuse career. So is this, do you see much of a connection between Schrader and Gadsden in the practices leading up to the season?
In camp, we didn't see a ton. That had kind of been one of the big questions for Syracuse's offense, was who is going to establish themselves as Syracuse's leading receiver. And going into the Purdue game, there still wasn't a clear answer to that question. Even Dino Babers was like, I don't know who the number 1 receiver is right now. Everyone's really spreading out receptions. I think coming out of the Purdue game, there's definitely a little bit more of a lean toward Gadsden, but he's in an interesting position because he's kind of playing the flex wide slot tight end type role, which does have a big role in this offensive scheme that Anae employs. But I think there'll be kind of like ebbs and flows of how often he gets the ball, but he has fabulous hands on him. He is an incredibly talented player. I mean, obviously comes from NFL pedigree. So I think we will still see a lot of him throughout the season. I'm not sure if he'll remain the leading receiver all year.
So Emily, one of the things that I really have been impressed with Syracuse in this year is their line, both offensive and defensive, have been significantly better than in the past. And being new coming in and maybe not having that background yet, and tapping into some of your colleagues and stuff, their knowledge base, it may put you at a disadvantage here just a little bit. But your observations from the standpoint of how this, let's start with the offensive line is doing, and seem to be doing a heck of a lot better in giving Schrader a lot more time, and then the defensive line, which is holding up a lot better and getting penetration.
Yeah, so the offensive line, from my understanding of, like you said, what people have told me the past couple of years, injuries has been the big thing that has kept it from succeeding. They couldn't keep a consistent five in the game to protect their QBs, so that was the big thing this year. Knock on wood, they haven't really had any injuries yet to their offensive line. Chris Elmore is out for the season. He was more of like a fullback, tight end, rotational offensive line guy, huge component to this team, but not necessarily to the offensive line unit. He wasn't like a starter in that group, but the rest of them are healthy. And I think the big thing that also helps is they have some young guys who are able to step in those moments when maybe the more veteran players who have a couple injuries, some bumps and bruises, those younger guys are able to step in. And one thing that I found really interesting that they did during fall camp was they really emphasized rotating all of the guys through different positions, minus center. They didn't do that as much with snapping the ball, obviously, but like between the guards and right side, left side, tackles, all of that stuff, they were really rotating players through so that if someone went down, it wasn't a situation where, oh, we only have one guy who knows how to play left tackle. No, they have 5 guys who know how to play left tackle, and they can move them around so that the guy who is best suited to be there can be in that position. So that, I think, has been the biggest thing for the offensive line.
Let me interject here for just a second, since you brought that part up. That's great management from the standpoint of recognizing point of failure and having backup, and making sure that you have people to fill in their slots. Who would you say is directly responsible? Is that coming from Babers or assistants?
It's hard to tell. I think it's probably a little bit of a mix of both. I think everyone on the coaching staff just kind of came to the recognition that they had been having problems with their offensive line, and they didn't necessarily have new personnel to immediately fix it. So they had to do something with the personnel they have. So I think it was a mix of everyone. I know Babers trusts his offensive line coach Mike Schmidt a lot, so I'm sure he had a big say in that, but I'm assuming it was most of the offensive coaching staff that kind of talked through that.
Okay, it was a good decision, no matter who made it, just because it's paying off. Let's get now into that defensive line for just a moment, because that has always been an issue. Actually, both lines have been an issue, and again, is this a reflection of Babers or the coaching assistants? And tell us your observations about what you're seeing there on that defensive line and how they're stepping up.
The defensive line has really been a big surprise, I think, not just to me, but to like everyone in the media up here, because through fall camp, up until the moment they snapped against Louisville, it was very much, we don't know what's going on with this group. There's a lot of young guys, not necessarily in age, but just in experience, because they lost a lot of starters coming off of last year. Mm-hmm. So there really didn't feel like there was 3 guys who were like completely locked in, who everyone knew were going to be able to handle these positions. But through 3 weeks, they've really held up. They've, like you've mentioned, gotten great penetration. I think we saw in the Purdue game, especially the second half, they were able to get after O'Connell, which is a halftime adjustment they made because they didn't feel like they were doing enough of that in the first half. Really made it an emphasis. It led to a defensive touchdown there late in the game that Caleb Okechukwu scored. So there's a lot of guys stepping up at defensive line. I mean, Terry Lockett and Caleb Okuchukwu have been like the two main guys, and they were two main backups last year. So that kind of made sense going in. But you have a new scholarship player, Kevin Darden. He had been a walk-on and just got promoted to scholarship this year. And he has been a playmaker for Syracuse so far. Jadius Gear is a redshirt freshman who's gotten a lot of playing time. So they might be young, but they are doing much better than everyone expected. So they've been pretty steady and strong for Syracuse.
A lot of energy on that team. You can just see it. You can feel it too. Is something more positive going on there than there has been. And one of the things that's kind of neat to me, I always keep an eye. I don't follow as closely the AP Top 25, at least in the first 3 weeks. Until we hit about the 4th or 5th week, I don't put much stock in it, to be honest with you. But the coaches poll out of USA Today, I do put more stock in because there is some input from the coaches there. And one of the things that I've noticed is that they're starting to recognize Syracuse, and Syracuse may not be in the top 25 yet, but they are in the receiving votes category at number 32. And that's a significant jump up this week from where they started, because it was kind of jokingly, I think the first week they had 1 vote. And I was trying to figure out who that was. But anyway, but up to 32 right now. And that's not too bad. We've got Pitt at 26, FSU at 27, and Syracuse at 32. That's pretty significant. What kind of impression does that give you, seeing that leap of faith from the coaches?
Yeah, it's funny. Baber said almost the exact same thing this morning, where someone asked him, like, what does it mean to be getting votes in the AP Top 25? And he's like, that's the one that the media does, right? No offense, I don't really care about that one. And he was like, coaches poll is what matters to me, because it's good to have coaches recognizing what your team is doing. And I totally understand that. Like, I think too, the coaches poll tends to be a little more diverse than the AP Top 25 is. I think people get sucked in and it ends up being the same teams over and over again. I am not an AP voter, let the record reflect, so I have no impact over that. But yeah, I mean, they've been getting votes. I don't remember what they were preseason, if they got any preseason, but I believe after the Louisville game, they had 4 votes in the coaches poll. Then it went up to 7 after week 2 against UConn. And then, now they have 24 votes in the poll. So like I said earlier, if they make it to 5-0 in the next 2 weeks, I think it's pretty fair to say that they would probably be ranked in both polls, at the very least in the coaches poll, especially when you look at teams like Miami is trending down. They've dropped like 12 spots in the past week after a terrible loss to Texas A&M. So I think we're definitely looking at a potentially ranked squad for the Orange here in the next couple of weeks, which is very exciting for them.
Emily, you have a feature up on Syracuse.com about your defensive coordinator, Tony White, someone who is kind of starting to make a name for himself, as Syracuse had the number 2 defense in the ACC last season in terms of yards per game, and you're seeing, a pretty good defense so far this year. So without giving much of the column away, what can you tell us about Tony White, the person?
Yeah, so Tony's really interesting. He's in his 3rd season up at Syracuse, but he's been coaching since 2008, I believe. He's part of the Rocky Long coaching tree, which is the 3-3-5 style of defense. That's also run by Zach Arnett down at Mississippi State. They work together. Arnett was supposed to have the position up here as Syracuse's defensive coordinator, and then Babers found White through Arnett. So that was kind of like an interesting little tidbit you can read more about in that story. But he's a guy that has really connected with the community here, even though they don't get to hear a lot from him. I mean, Syracuse doesn't let assistants or coordinators talk to media. So it's very rare that we get these opportunities to see inside their lives. But he's someone that I've heard from recruits really like. I've heard from other coaches, they really like him. All of the players on Syracuse's roster this year really like him. And the biggest thing I heard is that it's just he used to be kind of like an underdog guy himself. I mean, he grew up in Queens, moved to El Paso, and then was recruited kind of at the last minute to play at UCLA, and then had a stellar career there during a good period in UCLA's history. So he's kind of had to, not to use a cliche, but pull himself up by his bootstraps throughout his life. And I think he's pretty humble about that and uses those experiences to connect to his players. And I mean, that's just the best thing you can ask for in a coach.
One of the stars of this defense is Garrett Williams, someone who is, as a DB has been one of the top, players in the team in terms of tackles, even going back a couple of years, but he's really stood out this year as someone who's really been a star in this defense. What have you seen of him that makes him such a good player?
Yeah, the big thing is he's just a leader, I think. And Syracuse has a lot of those on the defensive side of the ball, but I think Garrett has really stepped up this season. He knows Tony's scheme really well. He plays really well in man coverage and against really talented wide receivers. I mean, Saturday against Purdue, he was put up against Charlie Jones, who's one of the best guys in the country. I think he has the highest average receptions per game, something like that. He's number one in one of the categories, but Garrett was placed up against him. And, I saw some complaints on Twitter, people being like, Garrett doesn't look ready for this game, whatever. But when you're he's going up against a really good guy, and like, there's a reason for that. Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is his leadership. I think that's the thing we hear from Babers every time we ask about Garrett Williams, is the type of guy he is in the locker room, the work he puts in off the field. I believe it was Garrett who told us that this season he's really trying to focus on the mental side of things. He puts a cap on how much homework he does so that he doesn't get too in his head about a game, because he likes to just go in and go with his gut, go with his instinct, which so far has worked pretty well for him. So I think the big thing we're seeing from him this season is more of the off the field stuff and the way he prepares for games, rather than any necessarily flashy plays, though he has had a few of those.
So I want to look ahead a little bit to Friday night. This is a really big game against Virginia. Obviously, Robert and I and Jason Beck both came from Virginia, and you saying earlier, wanting a more balanced offense and it not going that way does not surprise me as someone who's watched a lot of Virginia football over the last few years. And hopefully your offensive linemen are ready to catch passes. This is an inside joke, but no, seriously though, this is with kind of a national spotlight on this game on Friday night. Do you expect do you expect a really, really huge crowd for this game?
I think that's the hope. I don't know. I'm still kind of getting used to gauging what the football crowd is like here, and I think it's definitely different this year because they're much better than they have been. Mm-hmm. The dome capacity is around 50,000, I believe. Week 1 there was 37,000 in the house. This past week there was 35. I would guess maybe they get up to maybe 42-ish for this week's game. But the big thing is being inside a dome, everything is so echoey. So no matter how many people you have there, it gets loud in there. And we have an open air press box. So I hear everything that is being shouted by fans and things like that. And that's a loud environment to play in. So, I mean, even if the crowd is smaller than they're expecting, which I don't think it would be smaller than either of the two games they've had there so far, it's still going to be difficult for Virginia to contend with.
So someone who saw games in the old Metrodome, I totally understand the echo-ness of a dome carrying the crowd. But what do you think is the biggest key to victory for Syracuse in this game?
I think just getting back to what we saw in weeks 1 and 2. I mean, this past game, they really didn't look like themselves. Obviously, they came out with a win and they kind of fixed things near the fourth quarter and in the end there. But the first half of the game, it was like watching an entirely different team than I had seen the past 2 weeks. And there's some things going on with that. Like we heard from Schrader post game that he had dealt with something the week before. I've been told by some people there was maybe a sickness going around the team. So there might have been some extraneous factors that led to that kind of offness Saturday against Purdue. But I think the biggest thing will be just getting in there and getting back to their basics on offense. And then on defense, just shutting Brennan Armstrong down. I mean, he's a phenomenal quarterback. I'm really excited to see him play. And he has some good wide receivers in there too. And so I think kind of just having gone against a good receiving core in Purdue, that will really help Syracuse's secondary shutting down Virginia's wide receivers.
So, in addition to sports, you also do podcasts that are available on YouTube that touch on, let's call it contemporary culture. So, very interesting conversations, I thought, that were worth checking out. I started getting sucked in. In one of them, you talked about the series The Bear, starring Jeremy Allen White, who played Lip on Shameless, who I was a big fan of then. And I think that this new series is doing well too. But I always like to ask people who are doing something in a different silo from their main silo. If you're doing a podcast that's totally different, what's prompting that and what joy that brings to you?
Yeah, well, I've been a sports fan my entire life. I would say over the past, especially like 4 to 6 years, I've gotten really into a lot more of pop culture things, just as, I mean, the internet has evolved. And I mean, I'm a child of the internet, so I've just grown up with it my whole life. The other thing that's kind of been with me the same amount of time as sports has is Star Wars. I grew up on Star Wars, so that was kind of like an in for me into pop culture and nerd culture and things like that. So I've always been a big believer in you have to have things outside of work that you enjoy doing. And so that for me is just kind of something that it's nice to every once in a while stop and talk about something that's not how many passes Garrett Schrader is throwing each week or the latest AP poll or things like that. And it gives me an opportunity to talk with my friends, which especially during football season, it feels like there's not always time for.
So are you excited for the Andor show that's supposed to be coming out on Disney Plus?
Yes, I am very excited. I will be tuning in, probably not at midnight Eastern time, but or whenever it drops Eastern time. It's probably even later than that. It's probably like 2 a.m. But I will be tuning in first thing Wednesday when I wake up. I'm very excited for Andor.
Good. Yeah, I love the Mandalorian, and I thought it'll be got better as the season went on. So I'm hoping Andor is pretty good too.
Yeah, it seems like Andor is going to be a lot grittier, a lot more adult than some of the more recent things they've done. So I'm very excited to see kind of that tone shift from them.
Interesting. So we'll be looking forward to that interview and discussing that new series, which is, and really you ought to check this out, because I'm telling you, I absolutely got sucked into that conversation. And the next thing I know is like 20, 30 minutes have gone by. I'm going like, what? So it's good conversation and it's interesting. So I appreciate you doing that. By the way, your guest on that particular show, talking about the Bear, talking about being from Rockford. I'm also out of Rockford. I lived outside of Rockford. So when he started talking about Rockford, I was going like, yeah, okay. Homeboy. All right. Subscribe to ACC Nation on your favorite podcast and streaming radio platform, and be sure to like and subscribe to ACC Nation on YouTube. We want to thank our special guest, Emily Liker of Syracuse.com. If you're looking for great cues content, follow Emily on Twitter at EMLEIKER. It's really simple. EM Liker. And subscribe to Syracuse.com. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
Having me.